So, okay, Tom, over to you. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you very much. So I have changed the title of my talk a little bit and its contents just because of the fantastic talks I saw in the first couple of days. I got stimulated to put more in. So hopefully I can keep to time. If I don't keep to time, then someone just shout at me and I'll speed up. So I broadened it a little bit to include other forms of data collected from online. So iEcology is kind of a catch-all term for using data sets collected for other purposes other than biological recording and using them for biological recording. And then I'm going to talk a bit about visual storytelling or visualizations at the end. So as I said, changed a little bit. I'm going to talk first about using image classifiers to extract information from social media imagery, focusing on Flickr. Then I'm going to talk a bit about using Google Street View style imagery for monitoring species along linear infrastructure. And then I'm going to talk a bit about using social media text as a source of information, and then close up with the visual storytelling elements. So let me just plow straight on. I got very excited when I sort of first realized that image classifiers were at a point where they were, creating pretty reliable results for species identification. And I was thinking to myself about how these could be applied more broadly. And it struck me and many others that there are huge stores of visual data out there on social media platforms that are not part of our biological recording workflows, and yet they contain biological records data. And sometimes that's explicitly discussed, for example, an exchange on Twitter where people are asking for help of an identification. And sometimes it's not explicit at all. Someone's taken a picture of a plant and it happens to have an interesting insect on it, and there's no reference to that in the text associated with that observation whatsoever. So what I was interested in was, can I connect Flickr being a particularly good source of imagery, social media imagery, to the PlantNet API for image classification and creating new data sets that way. So there's in R, there's an R package that interacts with Flickr called Photo Searcher, and I wrote a very simple R package which interacts with the PlantNet API, and then I could connect those two things together. So what I did was I created a virtual botanist. So this is a map that shows all the records that virtual botanist observed. They went out to Flickr, they collected all the images from Flickr in London that referenced flower, and then I piped them all through the PlantNet image classifier. And then we've got pins for the locations of all those images, and you can see here when I click on them the image of the plant species, the species name given by the classifier, and the score given. And the pins are colored according to the accuracy. So these orange ones I'm clicking on now have a lower classification score, and the red ones have a really low classification score. And in fact, in both instances, they're not actually images of plants. So in this way, we've created this large data set. This is 60,000 biological records, or records of plants with a variation in the degree of certainty that they are plants, and in degree of certainty of the species classification. So there's some interesting features of this data set. For example, there's an image in there. My favorite image is a photograph of Van Gogh's sunflowers in the National Portrait Gallery, correctly identified as a sunflower. So that sort of highlights that these data sets are clearly not for biological collection, specifically biological recording, and so we have issues with the sorts of images that are contained within them. They're also strongly biased by population density. So on the right-hand side here, you can see London on the left, and the Peak District, which is a big rural area in the UK. You can see there's many more images in London than there are in the Peak District, and within both there are these areas highlighted with those rings and the yellow to red color where there's an extremely high density of recordings. And in the London image, that's Kew Gardens on the left and the Chelsea Flower Show in the center. So they're very biased spatially. Our existing data sets are biased as well, so we're not strangers to spatial bias, but these are particularly spatially biased. with Flickr, 25% of the images are geolocated. That's pretty good. On Twitter, it's around 1-2%. So quite a high proportion of images, of flowers at least, are georeferenced. If we look at the top two graphs here, this is the distribution in the classification score. So at the right-hand end, we're very confident with the identification. On the left-hand end, we're not very confident. And so you can see there's not a very high proportion of these observations where we have a classification score over, for example, 0.9, where we could be more confident that the classifier's got it right. But there is a peak in both these regions at the bottom end, which means there's lots of images where the classifier isn't confident. And so we looked into why that was, and it's because a lot of the images on Flickr, no surprise here, are not nice discrete images of an individual plant, which is what the classifier is designed to classify. A lot of them are images like these two underneath of a flower bed or something ornamental, where you wouldn't even know, well, you wouldn't know which plant you're supposed to be identifying. So the classifier doesn't really stand a chance. And so that's why we get a lot of these scores that are very low. So it's a sort of lesson learned from this. If we're thinking about applying this sorts of methodology for collecting data, and obviously this could be used for collecting data on alien invasive species, we think about whether the spatial distribution is appropriate for the question you're trying to answer. Can you filter these images more before they go into the image classifier? So I just filtered on anything that referenced flower, but I could have sort of done negative search terms, like got rid of flower beds or got rid of like flower show or those sorts of things to try and just filter down to the better images. What's the appropriate taxonomic resolution for your study? Because it might not be species, in which case you might be able to use classifiers to classify to a higher taxonomic resolution or lower taxonomic resolution, whichever way you look at it. Another thing that's important is think about how propagate uncertainty. So these classifiers are outputting a metric that can be thought of like a probability. And so how do you then propagate that probability through into your analysis? And at the end, thinking about, once you create a data set like this, how do you share it? How do you appropriately document it? What's the appropriate metadata you put with it? And how do you share it with a system like GBIF? And some of these are things that are being worked on, and some of them remain sort of open questions. So I want to move on fairly swiftly. At the same time, I was thinking another data set that has lots of imagery is Google Street View. And Google Street View, you can think of as a transect along roadways, and it's repeated. And so could provide valuable data about how invasive plants spread along and through the road network. And that is a network along which many or some invasive plant species do spread. The problem we had straight off the bat was that Google were not interested in sharing all their data with us. It's a commercially valuable product, and the terms of the API mean it's quite expensive if you do want to use it. So we built our own hardware, which you can see in the image on the right, which goes on top of the car and basically collects Google Street View type imagery. And we're using it initially for looking at invasive, so Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, but actually through that have found that other species, ragwort and ash, are of particular interest in the UK. So we're working with some computer scientists. They're developing the detection algorithms, and they have one for Himalayan balsam, and they have one that works really well for ragwort, and they're developing one for ash. We're currently redeploying the same system on trains, so putting a camera on the front of trains, mounting it on the front of the train, and then getting imagery along train networks, again, to help to monitor. In their case, mainly habitat quality and presence of ash, but that imagery could be repurposed for looking at invasive species moving along rail networks. We could also mount them on boats and look at sort of things spreading along rivers as well, although that's not something we've explicitly started to look at just yet. A student who's been working with me, Svetoslav, has been looking at text in social media. So there's a sort of growing suite of tools available for analyzing text, doing linguistic analysis. And they're typically born out of people who want to analyze product reviews and those sorts of things on Amazon to gain insights into, what people value about their product or don't value about their product. So they're not perfectly tuned to sort of wildlife applications, but we can use them in wildlife applications. And Svetoslav, who's just handed in his undergraduate thesis, was using them to look at the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic on sentiment around bats. So it's not uncommon for bats to receive negative sentiment, but we thought that COVID was a particular instance where that would occur. So these two graphs you see on the left are just two example metrics. He tested a whole suite of metrics, and this downward peak you see is a drop in sentiment during the initial COVID outbreak in sort of March, April of last year. So sentiment, things like a word like hate would have negative sentiment. So if the text contains the word hate, it would get a negative score. And we basically sum up the scores for all the words in that bit of text, and that gives you the overall sentiment. The texts he's using here are from Reddit. Reddit is a great open source repository of social media text. Twitter has also now made a lot of their data open, but that happened during this project, but it would be interesting to go back and compare these results to those from Twitter. So this is Reddit. You can see the sentiment drops, and then he was interested in these graphs. He's interested in how that recovers over time. On the right-hand side, you can see the word association with bat. Bat was our search term that we were looking at. The red below are words associated with bat during this sort of negative peak. The words above are those associated with bat in the period preceding the pandemic. And you can see the sort of misconceptions here around eating soup. These are misconceptions about the emergence of coronaviruses. And so this points to a way, I think that this tool points to a way of combating negative messaging. So hopefully you can see that this could be translated to an invasion. For example, Asian hornet arrives in your country. You could rapidly deploy this analysis to see how how sentiment is changing around Asian hornets, around pollinators. You could see the terms that are associated with that, and you could use that to frame your social media communications to help address negative sentiments or address misconceptions or address concerns. So hopefully I'll be able to convince Svetoslav that he should publish this, and we'll see more of this in the future. Mark Logie, who also works in my group, did some work looking at Twitter to try and see if he could more accurately time the sort of emergence of harlequin ladybird through the year than he could using the data collected through our citizen science projects like the UK Ladybird Survey, which was mentioned earlier, through the iRecord system. This is just a very preliminary pilot study, but what you can see on this graph is Twitter is in blue, and then our citizen science project is in that sort of greeny color. And they show a similar trend. What I would sort of pick out is that the Twitter signal is more peaky. So it seems that people are more kind of, on Twitter, they'll respond when something interesting happens. They'll start talking about it. Whereas on iRecord, you get more consistent reporting through the year. And it does have the same time signals. In fact, when we looked at the time signals, it did look like Twitter was maybe a few days previous, but it wasn't statistically significant. But certainly it was able to pick up the signals at the same time. So this suggests that if you're looking for phenological signals, changes in species through the year, then Twitter can be a good place to do that. And other people have done that. We're not unique in that, and other people have published papers on that. So it's not a new finding, but we thought this was quite interesting looking at the harlequin ladybird. So finally onto visual storytelling. Myself and Helen got interested in visual storytelling as distinct from data visualization last year. So data visualization is something that a lot of us on this call will be experts in, creating nice plots for your papers. But visual storytelling is going further. It's about bringing design principles into your visualization, creating images that look more like this one on the right, more like the ones you're going to see in newspapers, more like the ones you'll see in magazines, or you might have in a coffee table book. And so we were sort of, I guess, frustrated that we couldn't do this, and frustrated that other people were doing this with our data and we weren't doing it. So this on the right-hand side was using data collected from the Biological Record Center to look at how recording had changed during the first lockdown. This was created by a professional design company, and I look at this and I think that is beautiful, and I want to be able to do it. So we ran a course in visual storytelling at CEH, and we got a designer involved in it. And what my take home from that was that with a very limited training in design principles, you can produce really great images. And I think a lot of us are quite creative by nature, and you just need to understand some of these core design principles, and you can start to create stuff that is much more engaging. So my example of the one that I worked on this course was, we have this visualization on the left that we use in loads of our presentations that we give in our group, about how recording is spatially biased. And this is the sort of top 4 recorders of grasshoppers in the UK. And you can see that recording is spatially biased. And then I created a new figure on the right-hand side that we could use to replace these in our presentations, which has a sort of fun graphic of the UK, which kind of bloated by where we have the most recording, and uses these little sort of pick out tags, which has sort of little tags that sort of pulls out the story. There's not much going on in Scotland. Berkshire's county down in the bottom of the UK has a lot of records. It kind of lines things up. The spacing is sort of harmonized. The coloring is normalized, and this was done in a day, basically, from learning these design principles from our course. So I just really encourage people to go out there. There are resources out there. If you want to run a course, then let me know, and I can put you in touch with the facilitator we had, who was really fantastic. And these visualizations are clearly really important for telling the story of our research to people who are contributing to it. So in terms of feedback to volunteers, this is really important. And also, I think they can act as really good ways to motivate people to get involved in our projects. So I think I have, a final slide here, just to sort of wrap up on that sort of whistle-stop tour of the sort of eye ecology and visualization work that we've been involved in. So computer vision methods, as we've heard from other talks already, a great way to remove barrier to species identification, get more people engaged. Also a good way of collecting data from social media, but big biases that we need to understand, because these data sets are not collected with this intended purpose in mind. There's other ways that we can collect data, such as along road networks with cameras, and maybe one day we'll be able to get access to things like Google Street View. There are, Mapillary is an open source version of Google Street View, but to my mind, not quite yet of good enough quality for use for these methods. But there are other data sets out there. There's also these text data, which I think provide a really rich way to understand what people are thinking, and that we can use to help direct our messaging, perhaps around invasive species. And finally, visual storytelling, I think, is a really great tool with a little bit of training. I think a lot of us who are sort of more used to academic data visualizations, can start to create these really engaging visualizations that get people excited about the sort of work that we do. And I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for inviting me along. And sorry for slightly changing the topic of my talk.
No, it was great. Thanks so much, Tom. Was really inspiring, also because I liked very much the idea about this visual storytelling to involve more deeply people in citizen science and in other tasks as well. I think it's very important. So you raise a very, very good points in your presentation. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. So don't worry about changing a little bit. I think all the audience appreciate it. There is, Michael posted something in the chat, like this new study used a sample of Google Street View image to assess road verge composition. Possibly could be included in a citizen science project. So it's, I don't know if you, you can have a look to the link, and then you can go back to the comment. So I can see Jim. Jim is raising his hands. So, and then Sophie.
Just a short question. I'm not such an expert in social media, but stuff like Twitter, you have to follow certain people. So if you want to grab this kind of databases, what do you do then? Just follow everybody, or is there another way of getting access to all the Twitter accounts and messages and Flickr and whatever?
Yeah, I think Stefan might be able to probably better answer this than me, but you used to have to scrape it. So you can just search using search terms. But now they've made their archives available for research, but I haven't. That's as much as I know about it. I don't know how searchable it is. I think it's free for researchers. Maybe Stefan can add more. Just to come back on Michael's link, that paper is really great, but just be conscious that if you're going to use Google, the Google API explicitly says you can't create data from their imagery. So just make sure you're aware of their terms and conditions before using it.
Thank you very much. So Sophie is the next.